and welcome all of you once again. Today we begin with session 30.
Yes.
Yeah. So we go ahead. Last session, I think we had a sort of a very, pictorial effect. It was more like, a movie that was unfolding about the intensity about the siege. So today we have gone through that entire scene. Okay, we have seen how horrible the whole thing was. What the people in Jerusalem must have really, gone through, especially those who were trapped within, who had come for the feast of Passover, and later on also stayed on for Pentecost. So likely the people who were trapped inside, they were the ones who paid the greatest price. So let us see now what happens after the siege is over. The aftermath of the siege of Jerusalem. We know that Titus has been leading the siege. Okay, the soldiers, they literally had a lust for blood because of the intense, the 5 months wherein there were huge number of casualties also on the side of the Roman army. So that anger and that frustration and that, that pent up emotions all gave vent to the fury which finally, saw the entire temple being engulfed in not only the temple, but the entire city, even though, the rich quarter of the city of Jerusalem, more to the western side, and also to the southern side, everything was finished. So much so that, archaeological finds, they testify to the intensity of the siege and what a carnage it must have really been. That must have been the last place anybody would like to. To sum up now, the aftermath of the siege of Jerusalem, what happened after that? After the flames died out, the whole city we know was buried in ash. Nothing really remained, but more than the physical damage, it was the psychological shock and the trauma that the entire Jewish people who remained had to undergo. An entire new way of life opened up before them, something that was totally, unthinkable, because they never expected that God would abandon his sanctuary. So for them, it was a glory of God that departed from the temple, that God no longer, considered that to be the place where he will put his holy name. That was the biggest feeling boon for the people. So let us see. I've put one frame over here, just putting down the points in brief. We'll be going through. There was sheer carnage after Jerusalem fell. We know that, after what happened, there was literally a bloodbath on the Temple Mount. But not only that, even after that, after many days, for many days, they went on hunting down all the people who were hiding. There were fugitives everywhere. People had taken recourse. They were hiding in tunnels, and also they went on, ferreting all these people. I shared the pictures also with you last time. So blood and dead bodies were everywhere. You can just imagine. The whole nation came to be ruined after a siege of 5 long months. The entire city was in the hands of the victors, who ferreted out the fugitives in hiding in the city's underground tunnels. And according to Josephus, the total was 1.1 million Jews who died in the siege, out of which 11,000 and a little over from starvation itself. After the close of the siege, what happened after that? 97,000 captives, most of them the zealots who were there, and the people who had taken up arms, even the ordinary citizens, when they saw that the temple was in grave danger of being desecrated, everyone, united. I think somebody's mic is on. Can you please unmute yourself? To mute yourself? Yeah. So there were civilians also who took up arms, and they were slaughtered by the rampaging Roman army. But nonetheless, there were other people who were left behind. So captives were definitely taken, and this is something very normal in the aftermath of a siege or a war, whatever. So 97,000, Josephus tells us, 97,000 captives were sold into slavery. Some of them sent to the mines. They had their mines everywhere, especially their gold and copper mines. And to be, condemned to slave labor in a mines, that was more horrifying than to be in a prison. So many were sent to the mines or sacrificed. The saddest part was many of them were sacrificed in gladiatorial shows, combat shows at Caesarea. The nearest city was Caesarea, the one on the coast, which Herod the Great had very massively, built up and expanded and made it into a Roman colony. So these type of gladiator shows that were put up in the cities of Caesarea, Berytus, Antioch, and all other leading provinces and cities of the Roman Empire, they were taken over there and most of them sold into slavery. The strongest and the most handsome of men were chosen for the triumphal march or procession in Rome, which finally would take many months. So they were chosen. Why? Because for them the triumphal march was something that was a big honor that was granted to a triumphant general who would come back with all the trophies of war. And these people, the captives, the captured people, would be some of the trophies who would be paraded in the streets of Rome. So the strongest and the handsome of men were chosen for the triumphal march in Rome. Amongst them were the leaders of the Zealot party, including John of Kishla, and Simon Bar Giora. He was also taken, but he was slaughtered as sacrifice at the end of the triumphal march, because they were taken there, and the temple of Jupiter, the emperor was also like the supreme pontiff. So he was also like the pontifex, that is the high priest. So Simon of Giora was slaughtered there as sacrifice. So the whole of Judea was put under very strict government, and a decree was issued forbidding the rebuilding of the temple. Okay, last time I already shared with you, they had also come out with a coin, okay, Judea Capta, that is Judea captured, in order to commemorate this victory, because this victory was considered to be very, very highly prized. No doubt there was only rebellions all across the world, all across the Roman Empire. But this was a very hard won victory, something that they cherished, because they put up a spirited fight against the Judean fighters. We know that, how bravely they fought. So that is why this was a very cherished victory. And because of that, okay, Rome came out with this decree forbidding the rebuilding of the temple. Never again the Jews would be allowed to build their temple again, because they knew that so long as the temple would exist, the people would always rise up in rebellion against foreign occupiers. A decree was issued forbidding the rebuilding of the temple, and a permanent Roman legion, the Legio Ten Praetenses, this was, their star campaigners of the entire siege. So they were permanently garrisoned in Jerusalem, and we know this from all the archaeological finds that, testify to the desert. And they were stationed within the precincts of the fallen temple. Of course, they must have also been occupying the fortress Antonia, which was there. So part of the temple precincts also were taken by them. So in a sense, it was the end of the Jewish faith. The Jewish nation would never rise from these ashes ever again. No doubt later on, the siege of Masada, after 3 years, it would end. And after another few years, that is in 132 to 135, again there was another final second Jewish revolt. But that was a different thing, and it was not limited, it was not centered in Jerusalem at all. It was more centered in the countryside, and it was more like a messianic uprising, because the leader over there, Bar Kokhba, he was, thought to be, the rabbis thought that he was the promised Messiah who would again, lead the Jewish nation back to victory. So that was just a feeble sort, not a feeble attempt, of course, that was also a very strong rebellion, which was again crushed very badly, okay, with all their might. Emperor Hadrian was the one. And not only here, at least we had 3 legions in the siege of Jerusalem, but Hadrian brought in the full might of the Roman Empire. Some of the historians say almost 15 legions were, all congregated together in order to finish them. But records testify that at least 7 legions were there. We have to remember that in the entire Roman Empire, the total might of the Roman military was 30 30 legions, and each legion minimum 6,000 6,000 soldiers were there. So here it was practically the end of the Jewish nation. They would never again rise up from the ashes. How did the Jewish Christians at the time, now we come to this is the important thing, okay, the crux of our session today. How did the Jewish Christians at the time of these events when they were unfolding, how, and even after that, how did they view the fall of the temple? Let us have a look at this. As then and even now, the members of the Jewish movement, remember at that point of time, Christianity was not a term that was, given to the early Jesus followers. Scholars prefer to call that early Jewish, Christians soon after Jesus died and was resurrected, and the newly formed sort of a sect of Jewish religion was gaining numbers. They prefer to use this term, the Jesus movement. So the members of the Jesus movement felt this to be a sign that God was done with animal sacrifice. Because what was basically happening in the temple was animal sacrifice. The entire sacrificial cult, okay, the animals had to be brought to there for sacrifice. For what reason? Basically for remission of sins. So the entire sacrificial cult was centered only in the temple of Jerusalem. Animal sacrifices could not be performed anywhere besides the temple, and this was centralized by King Hezekiah way back 500 years ago. So from him and later on his grandson Josiah, he rigidly, saw to it that all animal sacrifices or whatever sacrifices had to be offered, okay, to Yahweh, it would be centralized only in the temple of Jerusalem. Because prior to that in the Old Testament, we know that there were sites like Shiloh, even Bethel, where these sacrifices were carried out. But once Jerusalem became the central sanctuary, all blood sacrifices had to be limited only to the temple of Jerusalem, nowhere else. So this was like the Christians who viewed this, the fall of Jerusalem, they felt this was a sign that God was done with animal sacrifice. Why? Because for them, as we also believe, Jesus was a final sacrifice, because even though you may want to replace blood sacrifice with Torah study, prayer, worship and fasting, as Hebrews 9:22 says, okay, without the shedding of blood, there is no remission. We may have all those things. So this was a big question. How will atonement of sins take place? It's fine. Later on, now when Rabbinic Judaism starts evolving and emerging, after the aftermath of the fall of the temple, it was more centered, we will see, on Torah study, on worship, fasting, okay, good deeds and all, and everything in the synagogue. But how would remission and atonement take place? Because in the Old Testament, it is very clearly God's command that it is only by blood, only through blood, that atonement can be made. There is no substitute for blood. Blood sacrifices could only be made at the temple and not any other place as decreed by God in the Old Testament. So without the temple, the sacrificial system completely collapsed. But God did not simply allow it to collapse. When we analyze these events and what really brought this entire downfall of the city of Jerusalem along with its central jewel, the temple, okay, we see God's hand very clearly at work. He gave ample signs before it went down. And today we will be focusing on what were the signs that God, gave the people of Jerusalem and the whole of Judea, but they were not really, paid heed to. God made a change in Jesus Christ. He said that forgiveness came only through his chosen sacrifice, and to make it abundantly clear, the previous manner, he said, was acceptable. He was making impossible to happen. So whatever was the previous manner on the Day of Atonement, okay, when the animal was sacrificed and all the sins of the nation were obliterated, in the sense they were covered. They were not completely taken away, and that is why year after year on the Day of Atonement, okay, that great ritual of the scapegoat and the other goat had to be done. So here it was clear that with Jesus' death, that was the final sacrifice that God had accepted. And Beyond that, there was no need for any more animal sacrifices in order to attain atonement. So he was clearly pointing to Jesus Christ as the only way to God, to have sins forgiven, and the only way to have sacrifice was that he was to be the sacrifice. So when we look, for us Christians, we are very firmly rooted in this belief that he was the ultimate sacrifice, and he himself was for any sacrifice, okay, it is a priest who is needed to officiate, okay, between the offerer and the deity. But in this case, when Jesus himself became the sacrifice, he not only was the offered, the victim, the sacrificial victim, but he was also the offerer. He was a high priest who was offering the sacrifice. And what sacrifice? Of his own life. So he was, okay, he was the temple. He was the high priest offering himself as sacrifice. And he is the offerer and the offered. Never in history you will find the high priest himself is offering himself, okay, as a sacrifice to be acceptable before God. But here in the case of Jesus' sacrifice, we will be dwelling much deeper later on. Jesus himself became that supreme sacrifice, and with that, that was a final thing. With his death, eternal redemption was gained for all. So with his own blood, he had won for us eternal redemption. And this is what, after he died, more or less in 38 or 33 AD, whatever, many of the scholars stick to the point of 30, we see that exactly after 40 years, the collapse of the temple and the entire sacrificial cult comes down. Okay, so let us see what were the signs that God was giving his own people, and what was he trying to say and convey through that. Jesus is the only way, and God had been pointing this out all through the ministry of Jesus. We know in the Gospel of Mark, we have had ample of episodes where Jesus, gives us episodes of his self-revelation. Wherever he says, he will say that word I am stood for the presence of Yahweh. So when he's talking about himself, he is actually hinting that he himself is the deity, okay, that he himself is God. So Jesus is the only way, and God has been pointing it out and authenticating whatever he was doing through his ministry and through his death, burial, and resurrection. Finally, things stopped working right after Jesus was crucified. Things that worked for 1,000 years, all this was going on, okay. In the book of Leviticus, we know we have detailed norms as to how, okay, the sanctuary has to be built, how the tabernacle would be erected, how the sacrifices, what kind of sacrifices, in detail to the last letter, everything was spelled out. And this was going on, and this was happening, and this was getting accepted. But here, okay, things that worked for 1,000 years, with Jesus' death in the year somewhere 30 or 33 AD, things began to stop. There were, very strange supernatural warnings and signs, which the Talmudic sages later on, the rabbis, after the fall of the temple, under the leadership of Yohanan ben Zakkai, when they all congregate together at the city of Jamni or Yamni, one and the same day. These are two names of the same city on the coast, okay, on the southern coast of Judea. So there, when they were gathering all these things, they were pondering on the things that were happening in the past few years preceding the final fall of the temple. And these are testimonies, these signs and warnings. These are not from Christian traditions and Christian literature. They are all gleaned from the rabbinic writings themselves. They are the ones who testify that these things happened. And every time they don't mention Jesus' name, but they say 40 years, every time, 40 years before the fall of the temple. And what is 40 years before the fall of the temple? That was precisely the time Jesus died. So from the time Jesus died, strange things were happening in Judea, which the people were not able to pick up. Let's take a look at these signs and warnings which came not from Christian sources but from Jewish sources and the Babylonian Talmud and the Precepta. All these are called rabbinic literature, okay? The Talmuds, the Mishnah, the Precepta, all of them, and other secular sources. First one, the first sign There are four signs that they attest in the Babylonian Talmud, and among this there are two Talmuds among the rabbis. One was the Babylonian Talmud and one was the Palestinian one. But it was the Babylonian Talmud that was held in very high esteem even as compared to the Palestinian Talmud. So here in the Babylonian Talmud, the sages, when they were reflecting, this is what they had come to the conclusion. Number one, the lot for the Lord's good. Now what is this? This is something attached to the Day of Atonement. Now this was a day, it was just one day, okay, in the entire Jewish calendar. It was a day of national mourning. Mourning for what? For their own sins. The entire nation would make, they would sort of fasting was absolutely essential. Okay, the whole day there would be a fast, and it was a great day of mourning for the entire country, for the nation. So during the ritual for the Day of Atonement, people had to congregate. This was also a day of national assembly. So just like the three festivals, even this was considered a day where all male Jews would come to the central sanctuary in Jerusalem. So during the ritual for the Day of Atonement, the high priest would draw a lot, because on the Day of Atonement they would bring, there was also later on bulls also being sacrificed, but symbolically there was something called the ritual of the scapegoat. There would be two goats who would be brought, looking more or less identical for the sacrifice. And what would be done? One of the goat was considered the goat for the Lord, and the other one was for Azazel. But till today, nobody knows who exactly is Azazel. Does it refer to the devil, or does it refer to an evil spirit? The Old Testament, none of the scholars are able to come to any agreement as to what exactly it is, but whatever. So one goat was meant for the Lord, okay, was considered the Lord's goat, and the second one was the scapegoat, who would be left out in the wilderness. The goat meant for the sacrifice was considered the Lord's goat. He would be sacrificed, and the blood would be collected in a vessel, and the high priest would sprinkle it on the altar. And this was the only day in the entire year the high priest was allowed to enter the Holy of Holies, okay, the entire inner sanctum. Nobody was allowed to go. Remember, Pompey made he performed sort of a very disrespectful act when very unknowingly or knowingly, whatever, he had stormed into the Holy of Holies, which was considered to be a great act of desecration. So here the Day of Atonement only was a time where the high priest would be allowed to enter the Holy of Holies. He would take the blood of that goat which was meant for the Lord and sprinkle it on the horns of the altar. And especially there was that cover on top which was called the seat of mercy. In Jewish terms, in Hebrew it is called the kaporet. It is called the seat of mercy. So when that blood was sprinkled on that, purification was won for the entire nation. Kaporet is also, the meaning of kaporet is cover, okay, to cover up. So the sins of the nation were covered. Okay, so the seat of mercy would be sprinkled with this blood of the sacrificial goat, and the other goat would be left out in the wilderness. And when left in the wilderness, they would make sure that finally he would topple down from the cliff, and that he wouldn't come back, because coming back would be considered a great omen. So this was this was the ritual that was carried out. So as I told you, the other goat, the scapegoat, would be led out from the eastern gate of the temple into the wilderness, and after the sins of the nation were transferred onto it by the high priest by laying his hands on it. Okay, they had that elaborate ritual by which the high priest would recite a big prayer, lay his hands on the scapegoat. That is why that word in English today till date it stands, like when somebody is being made, like in Hindi we say balika bakra. That is the same thing, the scapegoat. Like you are putting the blame of somebody on that person, so that person becomes a scapegoat. So you're literally the goat who is meant to be the scapegoat. All the sins of the nation would be transferred onto it, and then would be let out through the eastern gate. So this was the ritual that was carried out. And when this happened, when this happened, there used to be a thread that would be taken and would be tied to the doorpost of the temple's gate. And this thread used to be a scarlet thread. And the belief of the people, and historically it was also, attested in many this scarlet crimson thread, or this that was tied to the doorpost of the temple gate, okay, the door of the temple, it would turn white on its own, and that signaled, okay, the idea that the sins of the nation have been forgiven. A remission of sins has taken place. So the turning of that scarlet crimson, that crimson thread white, was a very, symbolic ritual for them. And to determine the fate of the two goats. Now, which of the two goats, which one would be for the Lord and which one would be for Azazel? So historically, the high priest would draw lots, okay, in a sort of a jar. They say, sort of some stones or something would be put, like, and it would be marked, one for the Lord and one for Azazel. So these lots would be drawn by the high priest, and consistently, historically, it is attested that the lot for the Lord's goat consistently would come up in the high priest's right hand. However, before the last 40 years before the destruction of the temple, the Lord ceased to come up in the right hand. And 40 years before the destruction of the temple puts it right at the time of Jesus' death by crucifixion. So God was pointing back to Jesus as if to say that animal sacrifices were no longer acceptable. Okay, my son has made the supreme sacrifice. With that, entire humanity has been redeemed. I do not need your sacrifices anymore. So this is what was happening. All this while, throughout the centuries, the lot for the Lord's goat always came up in the right hand. But after Jesus' death, this ceased to happen. Secondly, the crimson thread turning white. This was part of the scapegoat ritual, as I explained. After the scapegoat was led out into the wilderness, a crimson thread would be tied to the door of the temple, and after the scapegoat sent out into the wilderness died, the crimson thread would miraculously turn white, signifying that the Lord accepted the sacrifice for the purification of the nation. But again, 40 years before the fall of the temple, this crimson thread stopped turning white, compelling the priests to stop tying it outside the door of the temple, because it was very embarrassing. People would come to see whether it has turned white, and it wasn't turning white. So they stopped putting it outside the door of the temple and started instead tying it inside. What did it signify? What was it symbolic of? It showed that God was again not accepting animal sacrifices anymore, as Jesus was the final sacrifice. Remember when Jesus came about lashing, okay, and turned all the tables to the money changers and all? What was his protest against? It was a big statement that he made against the corruption that had had sucked the life out of the temple. Jesus then knew that this entire system was going to collapse. That was almost 40 years before the incident actually would happen. So this tradition also was one of the things that the rabbis of Yavne realized, that God was speaking to his people. He was sending the signs, but the nation failed to observe them. Okay. Another important sign the rabbis report, the western lamp of the golden menorah. Remember, the menorah is a 7-branched candle stand. It was considered one of the most prized possessions that the Roman army carried away, and it is very prominently displayed on the Arch of Titus. In this western lamp of the golden menorah, there were many other menorahs also, but this western lamp was a golden lampstand, very huge. Each of the 7 branches of the menorah would be filled with pure olive oil, and the same quantity in all the 7 containers. According to Jewish tradition, one of these lamps, called the western lamp, had a special status. Even though all the lamps received the same amount of oil, there was an expectation that it would burn more, because historically it had burning day and night and never going out. So this was, an established historical truth that this, Western lamp would never go out. This was seen as a supernatural sign that God's presence remained in the temple and accepting the worship of Israel. When this lamp stopped burning, it was a warning. And according to the Babylonian Talmud, since 40 years before the fall of the second temple, the Western lamp, was acting sort of very weird. It would go out repeatedly. The same Western lamp whose light never went off repeatedly would go out. This would happen even after it was relit each morning. This was disturbing to the priest as it was a sign that God was withdrawing his presence from the temple and that Israel's worship was no longer acceptable. So they knew that after the death of Yeshua, they would call Jesus, there was something really going on, something that was, very difficult to explain. It was also seen as divine judgment against Israel. So something that had not occurred all these centuries, more than 1,000 years, it was suddenly happening after the death of Jesus. At the very moment Jesus died and the veil in the temple separating the Holy of Holies from the people was torn, we say the Western lamp of the golden menorah stopped burning. It was a clear sign God's presence or his glory was departing from the temple. So this was the third sign as recorded by the Babylonian Talmud. Then this is quite spooky. The temple doors would open by themselves. Now which doors? The temple had many gates, we know that, okay? And the doors especially of the inner sanctum were extremely huge. The innermost was the biggest of all. These were the inner temple gates leading to the inner courts of the temple and its sanctuary. And these were likely one of the two gates, okay? Josephus also mentions about it, and the Babylonian Talmud does not tell us which of the gate, but one of the two gates consistently would, open by itself. These were likely one of the two gates, okay? That is the Nicanor gate, which was about 75 feet high and 60 feet wide. Can you imagine the size, okay, and the dimensions of the doors of this gate, okay? Or the Hekal. The second possible candidate is the Hekal, that is the sanctuary gate, okay? The innermost sanctuary leading to the Holy of Holies also had it. So that was even bigger, okay, but narrower. 82.5 feet by 24 feet, okay? The weight of these doors would be several tons and took multiple priests to open them each morning. So possibly no wind could, ever move them. These doors opening by themselves put the priests who saw it as a bad omen. They saw it as a sign that the doors would soon be opened by the enemies. Okay? The temple doors, this is continuing. So much so that one of the leading Pharisees even scolded the doors, saying, "Sanctuary, sanctuary, why do you frighten yourselves with the signs? I know about you that you will ultimately be destroyed as Zechariah son of Iddo has already prophesied. Open your doors, O Lebanon, that the fire may devour your cedars." What are these cedars? The doors were made of the cedars of Lebanon, which was considered to be the finest of wood, and in fact even today considered to be the finest of wood anywhere. So much so that the cedars of Lebanon, some of these are preserved today. I will share the pictures later on in the coming session. These are the cedars could, outlive, even more than 2,000 years it would last. And when this particular Pharisee, when he was scolding the doors because they were constantly opening by themselves, he's calling out to the doors, okay, why do you frighten us? We know that these things are coming. So you see how the Pharisees seem to be, being aware that something was going on, something very unnatural and difficult to explain. This was a reference to Zechariah, okay, the prophecy on Zechariah 11, chapter 11, verse 1, with Lebanon being interpreted as a temple, as the doors were made with the cedars of Lebanon, but inlaid with gold and bronze. That is why we know that, when the Romans carried away the loot and plunder of the temple of Jerusalem, possibly the doors also were carried away because they were, having huge bronze and inlaid with gold. So why will they leave that behind? So the view of the rabbis of the doors opening on their own was loss of divine protection, and that judgment in the form of desecration was soon to come. God was abandoning his sanctuary. So these four signs were the accepted signs by the Jewish leaders recorded in the Babylonian Talmud. They knew that God had given ample warnings, and this impending doom, was coming soon. These are the temples. Can you see how the size of a human being compared to them? Could these doors possibly open by themselves? Okay, so this is the Nicanor gate. Okay, the outer sanctuary. And possibly this, it can be one of these two gates. This is the Hekal, okay, 82.5 feet high, okay, that leads to the Holy of Holies. And possibly, most probably, it could have been the Nicanor gate, this one, okay. Now, these were the signs that were reported by the Babylonian Talmud, that is the Jewish leaders themselves later on after the fall of the temple. Now there were others that were reported by Josephus, not only him but other secular writers, which are also sometimes very chilling. Let's have a look. Josephus in particular reports, I mixed it up and made a correction. These are things that Josephus reports. He reports first, a sword image appeared over Jerusalem's night skies and remained there for several years prior to the fall of the temple. The second thing that he mentions is, the next thing he mentions is a bright light around the altar. Okay, the altar was very huge. I'll just take you back to the, can you see? This is the altar. This used to be the altar where this was the entire court of the priest, and the sacrifices would all be done, this huge altar. All the slaughtering and all used to be done by the priest over here. Here only the priest could enter, nobody else, and the animals would be sacrificed here on this altar. So a bright light around the altar. During the feast of unleavened bread, a great light shone around the altar around 3 a.m. in the morning for around half an hour, making it appear as if it was daytime. He reports this in particular. For the trained scribes, this was a bad omen, spelling the coming destruction of the temple. This was not a good sign as interpreted by them. And the third one appears to be, this is very weird. Many of the scholars make fun that this is very fanciful and not easy to believe. A cow that was brought to be sacrificed shortly after the bright light seen around the altar gave birth to a lamb. This was the weirdest thing Josephus tells us, and if it really happened, it is to be accounted as a miracle, a miraculous sign signifying something, as it would be violated. God himself would never violate his own natural law, because the natural laws tell us that every creature reproduces after its own kind. So this would definitely be violative of God's natural law. But symbolically, there's rich symbolism behind it. A cow giving birth to a lamb is something, unheard of. But symbolically interpreted, the picture is very striking. The cow, or sacrifice in the old system, represents the old covenant, involuntarily giving way to the new covenant represented by the lamb. And who is represented with the symbol of the lamb? Jesus himself, symbolizing the sacrifice of Jesus once and for all. So this, very bizarre thing Josephus reports. The fourth sign that Josephus reports is about the temple doors opening on their own, as recorded in the Talmuds, but he gives an additional detail. He adds something. He says, this massive gate, likely on the eastern side of the inner court, was closed each evening and secured with heavy iron bars. The doors were so massive that it took 20 minutes for the priest to just close it. So you can imagine, how could such doors, move by themselves? So definitely God was speaking through these signs. Yet around midnight, they were seen opening on their own. The security of the temple was dissolving. It was a sign that the temple was being handed over to the enemies and a time of desolation was nearing. This is, something very frightening that Josephus alone reports. And not only Josephus, even Tacitus mentions about this. Chariots of armies were seen flying in the night skies, encompassing the city. Josephus records a chilling detail of a booming voice heard at night in the inner courts of the temple by the 24 priests on their weekly roundup duties. There were this sort of what we call groups of priests, only 24 at a time. So each one would get an entire week, and it would be their duty. So earlier sessions we had shared this detail that by the time the turn of a particular priest would come, it would take at least minimum 3 months. So only that particular week they would be there on their full round of duty. So 24 priests. So these 24 priests, okay, they heard this when they were on their weekly round of duties, likely around Pentecost of 70 AD, which sounded like an army saying, okay, they heard sort of a very moving voice, we are departing. And he mentions this in particular. Later, rabbinic commentators interpreted this as a departure of the Shekinah glory or angelic host. In the Old Testament, whenever the Jews during their wilderness wanderings, their 40 years in the desert, when they were going along with the tabernacle, there was always a cloud, that was, covering the tabernacle, and that was considered to be the glory of God. So whenever the cloud was, when it would stop, they would stop. So that was referred to the Shekinah or the glory of God. Now it is called God's angelic host. So this detail what Josephus shares about chariots of armies seen flying in the night skies and a voice booming that we are departing. This is a sort of a vision which is also recorded in the book of Ezekiel. I'm not mentioning that here, but I'm just referring to it here. And these rabbinic commentators interpreted this like as if the Shekinah glory was departing from the temple, and this was the most telling of all omens. Christians would point back to the words of Jesus, see, your house is left to you desolate. And when the glory of God has departed from the temple, just as Ezekiel also had seen in the vision, here too, before the temple could fall, the rabbis, when reflecting later, they realized that God was already departing from the temple. His presence, that place had become empty and devoid of any meaning because God's presence was no longer over there. With the death of Jesus, okay, and his resurrection, with the sealing of the new covenant, everything was closed that was pertaining to the old system. Roman historian Tacitus records the same warnings about armies fighting in the air, the doors of the temple opening on their own, and the loud voice saying that the gods were departing. Tacitus is a Roman historian. So for the Romans, they were pagans. So they believed in a pantheon of all their gods assembled. So for them, it was like as if the gods were departing. There was another historian. This is another striking detail. The Greek historian Philostratus, he was a great friend of Nero's wife, okay, Poppaea. Writing in his book, The Life of Apollonius of Tyana, this Apollonius, he was a holy man, not a Christian, but he was a sort of a hermit who, finally he self-immolated himself. So he was considered a very saintly man. So Philostratus, when he was writing about this man, he makes some references also to the early Christians. And in that particular writing, there is a very telling quote where he quotes Emperor Titus, quotes that Emperor Titus, who destroyed Jerusalem, reportedly refused to accept the laurel wreath of victory for his conquest of Jerusalem, claiming that the victory did not come through his own efforts, but he was merely an instrument of God's wrath. And this probably is historically very true because Titus later on we know he took a Jewish wife, none other than Agrippa II's own sister, Berenike. So he was definitely influenced by her. So later on he must have, imagine if you were in the shoes of Titus and you have been at the helm of this whole thing of bringing down such a marvelous monument, it would be something that would weigh on your conscience for life. So definitely Titus too must have had his own nightmares regarding this. So this particular historian, he mentions this incident when he was offered the laurel wreath The wreath was, made with laurels. It signified greatness. So any victorious general, when he was, brought in the triumphal parade, the procession through the streets of Rome, finally it would be culminate in, crowning the person with a laurel wreath. But he refused to accept it, attributing that victory not to his own efforts, and probably must have realized there was something, that he was an instrument, okay, in the hand of God, an instrument of God's rod to teach the people the lesson they deserve. It's amazing how we have all this information. Josephus is a non-believing Jewish historian, Titus a non-believing Roman. They understood that the judgment of God was upon Jerusalem. Others could see what was staring the Jewish people right in the face, but most of the Jews remained blinded to it. But we know from the events that we have gone through, not everybody was with. It was basically the Zealots, and in particular the Sicarii, who tilted the entire balance, okay, against the will of the people. And here, the prophecy of Isaiah chapter 1:3 rings very true. The ox knows its master, the donkey its own manger, but Israel does not know. My people do not understand. So this must have been God. God must have been repelled by the corruption that was happening. His people, who were meant to be a holy nation and an example to the entire world, what were they doing? Everything was empty. The love of God was not at the core of their hearts, and all the sacrificial cult that they engaged in came to be very, very meaningless. And this is what God did not like. It probably these are the things that God wanted to convey to his people. God was doing something completely different. He was dismantling the old system and its way of doing things to usher in the new. And the new was already ushered in, okay, 40 years ago, but not everybody had that insight to see it. The Tosefta, a compilation of laws around this time, records that every Shabbat, okay, the Sabbath day is called the Shabbat, there used to be 12 loaves of bread as laid out on the golden table, or shewbread, or called the showbread, in the holy place, in the temple. It was customary that when the new the setup of the priests, 24 priests would come in for their turn, others would be going and replacing them. So the new ones who would be coming, they would also go and replace the 12 loaves, which symbolize the 12 tribes of Israel. So fresh loaves would be put on that golden table of shewbread, or the showbread. And it was an attested fact that for 1500 years, these loaves, when they were replaced, the ones that were being removed would remain as fresh as new. And for 1500 years, this occurred uninterrupted. But this stopped happening around the same time that Jesus died. That is around 40 years before the fall of the temple. This bread no longer started remaining, fresh as they used to be in the past. They started turning stale, something that was, completely new. And the exact moment that the Tosefta records it was 40 years before the fall of the temple, coinciding again with the death of Jesus. Secondly, the wood for the altar required constant replenishing just around the time since Jesus' death. Something which was miraculously sustained with the altar, not requiring much wood at all for centuries. For centuries, that huge altar had to be stocked up with lot of wood was required, no? Especially if it was a burnt offering, till the ashes, like lot of wood would be required. But miraculously, when the sacrificial cult was practiced in the temple, not much wood used to be required. But ever since the time of Jesus' death, the wood required complete constant replenishing, like more and more, like it was not like it would just disappear. Okay, so it was something like as if God was disappointed and was not happy with what was happening going around. The Tosefta also records that 40 years before the fall of the temple, the Sanhedrin, the supreme Jewish council of 73 elders, which functioned as the Supreme Court of the Jewish people. Remember, we said the sanctuary was not only a place, the Temple of Jerusalem was not only a place of worship, but it was also an economic hub, and it was also a place where justice was meted out. Okay, so it was a place where cases were heard. And who used to be hearing the cases and giving judgments? The Sanhedrin, which was the supreme council of 70 Jewish elders, which comprised not only of the high priest and the entire chief priest from the Jerusalem, but also Pharisees, scribes, some of the respected elders of the city, and also not only from Jerusalem proper, but from outside of Jerusalem too. So they used to meet there at a place in the temple precincts. This is actually, I didn't get the time to put the picture, but this has been discovered. Okay, the chamber of the hewn stone. This used to be the place from where judgments would be, given out by the Sanhedrin. This is the same council, we have to remember, condemned Jesus also to them for blasphemy. But this Sanhedrin removed itself from the chamber of the hewn stone, which in Hebrew is called the Lishkat HaKazim, which lay within the sacred precincts of the Temple Mount, and relocated, literally sort of exiled itself to a place called Shanuit, or the shops down below. Okay, from that day on, they stopped judging capital cases. Whatever cases that required capital punishment means is a death sentence. Okay, such cases they stopped. Okay, adjudicating, they would not give any judgment in those cases. They stopped hearing those cases. Their self-exile meant that they were abandoning that sanctified space and relinquishing their judicial jurisdiction over life and death. Rabbinical traditions link this move to the growing instability and deep divisions into factions that brought the ruin of the entire city. So this self-exile of the Sanhedrin was very symbolic. It signaled, the entire fracture of the unity of the people in Judea. The Jerusalem Talmud and the Tosefta record that on the day the Romans burst into the temple, the Levites were in the middle of singing Psalm 94, and specifically they had reached verse 23. And look at the coincidence, how telling it is. What were they singing? They were the Levitical singers, no? They would be the priests. And the temple liturgy, used to be really very beautiful, much because of the Levitical singers who would play their beautiful instruments. So even when the Romans were storming in, they were continuing with their song. And ironically, what was the verse of Psalm 94 they were singing? He has brought upon them their own iniquity. Who is he? God. He has brought upon them their own iniquity, that is sin, and he will cut them off in their own evil. They never finished the song as the Romans stormed inside the temple mid-verse. The last prophet to Jerusalem, the last sign. We have already touched upon this. Joshua ben Ananias, was the son of a farmer. He was the last prophet who went on, for 7 years and 5 months. We know this. Go to Jerusalem, and finally a ballista from the siege engines comes and hits him, and that's how he dies. I have put out here for you to read. I will not read this out, what Josephus writes about him. In particular, only what has been highlighted I will write. He came, 1 year, 4 years before the war, when the city was enjoying peace. He comes there to the feast, and in a loud voice, he shouts out crying, a voice from the east, a voice from the west, a voice from the four winds, a voice against Jerusalem and the sanctuary, a voice against the bridegroom and the bride, a voice against all the people. So much so that, these leading citizens were so angry with him, because this is exactly what even Jeremiah did, just before the fall of the first temple. And what did they do? They were so angry, all the elite in Jerusalem, they bound him and threw him in the cistern. And the same thing was done here. The people were so incensed with what he was saying, all type of ill-fated words that he was uttering. They arrested him and took him to that at that point of time, the Roman governor, I think it was Albinus who was there, they took him, flogged him so badly. Okay, when Albinus, the governor, asked him who and whence he was and why he uttered these cries, he answered him not a word, but unceasingly reiterated his dirge over the city, the same mournful tunes he went on. So he would not, speak in his own famous. Albinus finally pronounced him a maniac, that is mad, and let him go. But finally, even so, he went on like this for 7 years. Read this whole thing because this is the testimony of Josephus about it. So he went on like this for 7 years and 5 months, crying, wailing loudly, his voice never flagging, nor his strength exhausted, until in the siege, having seen his presage verified, he found his rest. For while going his round and shouting in piercing tones from the wall, woe to Jerusalem, woe once more to the city, and to the people, and to the temple, as he added one last word to it, and woe to me also. And when he said that, a stone hurled from the ballista struck and killed him on the spot. So with those ominous words still upon his lips, he passed away. So this is the testimony. So he was the last prophet to Jerusalem. And this is what Josephus, makes the final lament in his great work, okay, the War of the Jews, Bellum Judaicum, okay, the War of the Jews. His final lament over the ruin of his people and the city of Jerusalem. And he must have, years later when he was writing this account, he must have been reflecting with great pain the events to which he himself was an eyewitness, all the bloodshed, the madness that had engulfed the nation, he witnessed it firsthand. So in the end he writes, I will not hesitate to say what gives me pain. I believe that had the Romans delayed their punishment of these villains, the city would have been swallowed up by the earth, or overwhelmed with a flood, or like Sodom, consumed with fire from heaven, for the generation which was in it was far more ungodly than the men on whom these punishments had in former times fallen. By their madness, the whole nation came to be ruined. And Josephus is lamenting why? Because he saw for himself how savage these men had become, especially not only the zealots, the Sikari, but also among the priests, also the younger sons of the Jerusalem priests, and all, how that entire bloodlust and that hunger for power in order to have control, it drove them, finally to the ruin of the entire nation. So what Josephus, in hindsight, as he analyzes all the events and makes this judgment, is so very true, because he makes a very telling comparison. He compares them to the people of Sodom, and he says very clearly that even if the Romans had delayed their punishment, and if the city had not met its fate at the hands of the Romans, still because of the wickedness of the people of the generation which specifically was there at the time in Jerusalem, they were such ungodly people, such savage men, that the punishment would definitely come their way. Okay, so he attributes to their savagery, to their madness, to their maniacal ways. Now coming to the tradition tells us that when the events in Jerusalem were unfolding and spiraling out of control and the siege becoming imminent, most of the Jewish Christians fled to a place called Pella beyond the Jordan. The flight to Pella, today in scholarly circles, this whole event is referred to as a flight to Pella. The flight to Pella refers to a tradition, okay, this early tradition within early Christianity. Before the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70, the Christian community in Jerusalem was instructed by an oracular revelation. Okay, a prophetic vision was given to them to flee to Pella in the Decapolis. Which was this Decapolis region? We have seen this was that group of 10 cities across the Jordan. This was a place where Jesus also often, he would cross the Sea of Galilee and go over there for his ministry. So that oracular revelation asked the Jewish Christians, okay, the early members of the Jewish movement, to flee, because whatever Jesus had said was coming true. And remember, Jesus had said, when these events occur, See that you fly into the mountains. He had said, go away to the mountains. But what did the people in Judea do? Instead of going to the mountains and hiding somewhere, they came into the city. Okay, so this is exactly, they took Jesus at his word. They fled to Pella in the Decapolis region. This migration is recounted by church fathers. How do we know about this? Because this is mentioned by Eusebius of Caesarea, who wrote in the 4th century the early church history. Okay, and through him we know that this was, how the people had gone and they were saved. Another writer, Epiphanius, who was also a bishop of Salamis, he also records this early tradition. So definitely there is great truth in it. Though archaeologically there are digs that are going on, there are, finds which attest indirectly to the presence, okay, of the Christian community. But as of now, completely there is no, attested fact to say that this was really the truth. This is the ancient site of Pella. It was a very beautiful valley, okay, across the Jordan. So most likely this was later on, after the Jewish revolt of 70 AD, it became a very bustling Roman city. But of course it was also a Roman center prior to that also. But scholars, especially there's one particular scholar called Schumacher, he makes the speculation that they must have not fled and stayed over here, because these were all Greek-speaking people, okay, and the Greek-speaking people held a lot of animosity towards the Jewish people. Remember at the outbreak of the war also, there were a lot of massacres all over. So the Jews massacred the Gentiles and the Gentiles massacred the Jews. So probably they must have not gone to these places, but there's an alternate place. There used to be caves where they must have probably hidden. I will not read this out, okay, that same matter I put away. When the people of the church in Jerusalem were instructed by an oracular revelation delivered to worthy men, they had to move away from the city. These are the words actually of Eusebius. Okay, he was a bishop of Caesarea. The first systematic exploration of Pella, I told you, was taken by the Schumacher, and that is why those caves that he proposes somewhere here, okay, they are called Schumacher's caves. You can go through it. I've just put out this additional information for you. Okay, the same site. See, this was the place. Okay, they were all here holed up in Jerusalem. They crossed the Jordan, and from here up they went here to Pella. And that's how Pella became a great Christian center, we know, and especially of the Ebionites, who later on were branded as heretics later. This is that impressive, okay, civic complex, okay, Roman, which has been discovered. It was built in year, it's given AD 160 AD. That is soon after the fall of the temple. These are the ongoing excavations of the Roman site at Pella. Now, why Pella? Cautious speculation suggests that there may have been some local connection between the Galilean leaders of the early Christian community and prominent cities of Pella. Remember, Jesus would often cross and go there for his ministry, for his evangelization. So Pella was just barely 20 miles south of the Sea of Galilee. So maybe already, that was a place which was most favorable and safe for them to go. We know that, when Vespasian in 67 AD, when he came with his rampaging armies, how he decimated the populations across Galilee and the people were fleeing. So most of the people, even at that point of time, they say must have fled to Pella. The Gospels and Acts make it clear that the northern Jordan Valley region was familiar territory for the predominantly Galilean early church leaders. Some scholars have suggested that at least some of John the Baptist's earlier missionary work also must have taken place in the northern Jordan Valley, because we normally think that he only, rendered baptisms in the southern Jordan Valley. But today we know that, John must have gone up there to the north also. More practically, 3 of the best crossing points in the northern Jordan Valley, because not everywhere you could cross the river. There were certain points where the depth of the water was low, and from there, those were the best crossing points. So 3 of the best crossing points in the northern Jordan Valley fall within the territory of Pella. So likely, this must have been the place. With Galilee itself already devastated and occupied by the Romans, okay, after the start of the revolt in 66, Pella might have seemed the safest short-term bet in a very difficult neighborhood, because remember, uh, they were all Greek speaking people, highly polished, sophisticated people. So definitely they would not be very welcoming to this fleeing Jews. The Christian apologist Aristotle, scholar, okay, early to mid second century, came from Pella. So we know a person of such high standing who came to be a renowned Christian scholar. Okay, he wrote apologetic writings in defense of the new faith. Coming from Pella implies that a significant Christian presence in the second century AD, if not earlier, was already there. Later Christian historians like Eusebius make it clear that Pella was considered a wellspring of early Jewish Christian Ebionite thought. Remember, we looked at the heretics, okay, the Gnostics, and one of them was the Ebionites, who were later, they were too rigid, okay, and to held on too rigidly to Jewish practices, wouldn't, let go. They were the greatest enemies of Paul, because Paul was all for Gentile Christianity, but the Ebionites would not allow, because they felt that, they had to first be Jew in order to be Christian, which Paul disagreed. So this Ebionites, they must have, flourished over there, prospered over there, but later on their beliefs became very heretical. Okay, they were condemned as a heresy by Byzantine authorities, that is the Eastern Roman Empire. If the early Christians fled from Jerusalem to Pella, they may have been the beginning